Ryan McMaken is the economics editor and communications director at the Misuse Institute, which, of course, you can visit at mises.org.
You have done a series of articles relating to the general subject of policing. It seems to be the case that more often than you would expect, police encounters seem to escalate from something more or less mundane to, in some cases, something quite terrible. What do you think the answer is?
Well, the FBI is an example of this. It was created in this period of the early 20th century where the feds started passing statutes about peaceful activities like creating drugs or selling drugs, as well as other business-related type of activities that nobody would have identified as a crime in the 19th century. Most people thought of crime as violent crime. But this was a period then, okay, we're going to assign the FBI or other federal agencies to finding who's making bathtub gin, and we're going to track these people down. And then there's gun runners. We got to track them down. So all of a sudden now in the 20th century, government's in the business of searching people, where simply possessing things are a crime, whereas in the past you had to actually do criminal things. You couldn't just simply possess certain objects and be considered a criminal. If you're in a situation where the police see it as their duty to search people and constantly control what it is that people own, what it is that people sell, then their whole relationship with you is different now. Okay, I pulled somebody over for speeding or whatever. In a more sane world, they would simply issue your citation and let you go, unless they had reason to believe that you had just robbed a bank or something like that. However, now every traffic stop, every encounter is an opportunity to see, well, maybe this person has some drugs on them. Maybe this person has an illegal gun in the back of the car. So they start questioning you. They act like they're your friend. Let's casually see if they're in possession of something that I should be taking away and so on. So now every interaction with the police is an opportunity to escalate to a situation where you might be serving decades in jail or in prison. And so this makes people, of course, very touchy, more likely to actually act out. And in a lot of cases, sure, yeah, these people do have drugs on them because they're drug addicts and so on. Whereas in the past, that thing would have simply been ignored. People would have been cited for actually violent or antisocial behavior. But those days are gone now, and now it's the police's job to regulate many aspects of your life and to engage in regular searches. So you've just set up everything to escalate to a violent situation. And that's part of the reason that we see so many of these things in the news where, well, they pulled over some guy and the next thing you know, shooting breaks out, or the cops are all paranoid and they open fire. They wanted to search. This created bad blood and so on.
Told you.
There's really no need for that, but that's where we've come in the last several decades.
There's also the social phenomenon whereby a segment of the population looks to the police to a degree that is unreasonable. You gave the example of a mom whose son is playing video games too often, so she calls the police.
My guess is that next time the child's told to turn the Xbox off, they probably won't think twice.
This is exactly the wrong way to go about things. And I know people who say never, ever call the police. But certainly if you're going to call the police, it should absolutely be a last resort when there's absolutely nothing else you can do. But we've gotten this superstitious view that the police are necessary to solve all kinds of problems.
Of course, people call the police all the time because they have like a disagreeable family member or there's something happening totally on private property that you wouldn't even classify as violent. But we want the police to show up and solve the problem for us. Someone won't take their meds, for example, or I can't convince this guy to go to the hospital. These things often end in shootings and other unpleasant things that occur, escalations and such. Why is the police's job to show up and have somebody get to the hospital and so on? This person's an adult. It's up to them whether they take their meds and so on. And part of the reason is simple economics. Oh, I've got a problem. I can call 911 and people will show up for free. They'll show up, they'll help my mentally ill brother take his meds or whatever. And guess what? It doesn't cost me a dime. So every time there's some sort of unpleasantness happening, well, I'll just call the police. And then this, of course, bleeds into more institutional situations as well, where you've got places like movie theaters or private gated communities and so on. These places should be in charge of their own private security. But since it's all state subsidized and you can call the police to come in, show up for free and do all that for you, now people are like, well, why should I do private security? I can just have the police show up and solve all these little problems from A to Z. And what we have found now is that people have adopted this idea that, oh, well, this is a job for the police. So it socializes the costs of police services. It encourages encourages people not to plan ahead for their own needs or to develop organizations and social networks that might help them solve some of these social problems. Just simply call the police. They'll show up, and then when they're done, you won't get a bill for it. Imagine if it was the same way for calling an ambulance. I've got a minor pain. I cut my foot. So just call an ambulance and they'll take me to the emergency room. Now, of course, you do that now, you get a huge bill for a couple grand or something, as it should be when you could have just driven yourself to the emergency room. And so treating the police a little bit differently in that regard might go a long way toward reducing costs and reducing reliance on the police.
Well, I'll tell you, I did an episode with Bruce Benson on the subject of private police. So I'm going to link to that also at tomwoods.com/719 along with your articles, because people might genuinely want to know what would that look like and how would that work. And that's a whole separate question. And of course, it's a question that most free market people don't raise, because respectable free market people, and I'm not saying this to be to taunt them or anything, because I was one too. It just never dawns on them that the same economic principles they apply to the supply of any other good or service, they can't or won't imagine them applied to the production of security. But security is an economic good. We have scarce resources, and of course we all want security, but manpower that's devoted to security, it has to be withdrawn from something else. So we have competing ends, and there has to be some way to decide how these labor services ought to be allocated, and we haven't come up with a better system than system of economic calculation on the market. So it's not so crazy after all. And of course, libertarians like to point out that when you're at Disney World, you don't feel unsafe, even though there are no public police anywhere to be found. And generally, you don't even see any private security. But yet you know they've got a handle on that situation, that somehow they know what they're doing, and they do it without a guy walking down the street with an Uzi or something. They've figured out a way to provide security in an unobtrusive way that makes people feel comfortable over a very, very large area. So sometimes it's useful to think this way and to think in creative ways about things that we've up to now thought quite conventionally about.
Yeah, well, we certainly don't want to be those libertarians who say, well, if you just get rid of the police, everybody will get along. I mean, certainly we don't think that's true.
You gotta have some kind of security, right?
Right, and private security has been effective and used in the past, as noted in all of this research on the Pinkertons. You don't need the FBI to, for example, provide security for trains. Even though they go from state to state and grow across the country. And they weren't the only private organization. There were tons of them. At the time, if you needed investigative services of some kind, you paid for one of these private organizations to do it. Now, you could argue, what about poor people? Do they get any services? That doesn't necessarily mean you need a huge federal agency to address that issue. That can be addressed in other ways. And I don't even take a particularly radical view. I just simply note some ways that you can chip away at eliminating the government monopoly on police. You can simply make more room for private security in these cases, which is what we find happening right now anyway. Just as in the 19th century, when there was declining faith in local police to provide services, people turned to private security to fill in the gap, and they did that quite effectively. And they didn't ban the use of public police. They just simply did not have an over-reliance on it and recognize its shortcomings. And people are doing that now, although it's not, of course, reported or lauded in any ways, that people are turning more toward private security. The numbers of private security personnel have been going up significantly. It's just amazing how much people rely on policing, how inappropriate it is a lot of the time. If you've got a homeless guy who just kind of passed out in your yard, or he kind of set up shop next to you, you don't necessarily need heavily armed guys with guns to show up and escalate that situation immediately. Now, if the guy turns violent, then yes, maybe you would need policing, but that is often not what happens. However, the first line of contact with the state is with armed police. And I think experience has shown that's not necessarily the best way of going about things.
Well, I'm going to link to your stuff at tomwoods.com/719.